You are listening to Unseen Givens by Elton Thomas. Part 1, Chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1, First Day at Givens Corp. Part 1, Arrival. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Laura stepped out, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor of Givens Corp's sleek and modern lobby. Her eyes scanned the vast open space before her, taking in the clean, angular lines of the architecture. Everything seemed designed to impress. The glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, allowing sunlight to flood in and bounce off the chrome accents that adorned every surface. She swallowed, her throat dry with nerves, and adjusted the strap of her leather handbag, trying to appear calm and collected. It felt surreal, being here, of all places. The most prestigious marketing firm in the country. Givens Corp was a name synonymous with success, power, and innovation. Laura had heard of it long before she ever thought she'd have the chance to work within its walls. She still wasn't entirely sure how she had been chosen. The hiring process had been grueling, with each interview more intense than the last. And yet, here she was. Nancy, the office manager, was waiting for her near the reception desk, a woman of striking presence despite her understated appearance. With shoulder-length chestnut hair tied back in a practical ponytail and a no-nonsense expression, Nancy radiated efficiency. She wore a dark tailored suit that fit her perfectly, but there was something about her manner that suggested she was ready to roll up her sleeves at any moment. "Laura, welcome to Givens Corp," Nancy said, her voice warm but brisk, like a teacher on the first day of school greeting a new student. Her handshake was firm, but not forceful, just the right balance. Laura appreciated that. "How was the commute?" "Not bad, surprisingly. It's not far from my place," Laura replied, her voice a little higher than usual. She could feel the nervous energy bubbling beneath her calm exterior, but she managed to keep it in check. She always did. Her husband Sam used to joke about how she could stay mellow even when the world seemed to be falling apart around her. It was a trait that had served her well, though she wasn't sure how long she could maintain it today. Nancy gave a nod and smiled, her sharp eyes assessing Laura in a way that seemed almost habitual. "Good. You'll get used to the rhythm of this place in no time. I'll show you to your office." The receptionist, Sharon Autumn Davis, waved from behind the sleek mahogany desk. "Welcome aboard," she called with a friendly smile that seemed genuinely excited. Sharon had a warmth about her that contrasted with the otherwise formal atmosphere. It was the kind of smile that made you feel instantly welcome, as though you weren't just another new face in a company of hundreds. Laura smiled back, grateful for the small gesture of warmth. "Thanks, Sharon." She followed Nancy through a set of glass doors, her shoes now muffled by the plush, deep gray carpeting that covered the hallways. Everything about the building's interior felt intentional, sophisticated, but understated. The walls were lined with abstract art, each piece a swirl of colors and shapes that seemed to hint at deeper meanings just beyond comprehension. The light fixtures were sleek and minimalist, casting a soft, even glow throughout the corridors. "This place is beautiful," Laura said, more to herself than to Nancy, but Nancy heard her anyway. "It grows on you," Nancy replied. "At first it can feel a bit overwhelming, but once you settle in, you'll start to appreciate the attention to detail. Mr. Givens is very particular about that." Mr. Givens. Nathan Ross Givens, the man behind the empire. Laura had never met him, and in truth, she wasn't sure she ever would. People spoke of him like a legend, someone whose presence was felt more than seen. Ross Givens, NRG, a man whose initials fittingly symbolized the energy that had driven the company to the top. The rumor was that he had a way of knowing everything that happened in his company, even though he was rarely seen. Laura and Nancy turned a corner, and the hallway opened into a large workspace with a high ceiling and a panoramic view of the city skyline. Rows of glass-walled offices lined the perimeter of the space, while the center was filled with workstations that hummed with quiet activity. Employees sat at their desks, focused on their screens, their fingers dancing across keyboards as they worked with quiet intensity. Phones buzzed softly, and conversations were murmured just low enough not to disturb the flow. Nancy led Laura toward an office at the far end of the room, marked with her name, Melissa Laura Owens, business analyst. Seeing her name engraved on the plaque sent a strange thrill through Laura's chest. It felt real now. She was here. She'd made it. "This is your office," Nancy said, opening the door and stepping aside for Laura to enter. Laura hesitated for a moment before walking inside. The room was sleek and modern, just like the rest of the building, but it felt personal too. A large window took up the entire back wall, flooding the room with natural light and offering a stunning view of the city below. The desk, a minimalist piece of dark wood and glass, sat in the center of the room, angled toward the window. The computer was already set up, the sleek monitor glinting in the sunlight. Laura took a deep breath and stepped forward, running her fingers along the smooth edge of the desk. She could feel the weight of her journey in this moment, everything it had taken to get here. The late nights, the countless interviews, the uncertainty of whether she was even the right fit for such a prestigious position. And yet, here she was. She set her handbag down on the desk and reached inside, pulling out a small, worn photograph that she always carried with her. It was slightly faded around the edges, but the image remained sharp and clear. Her son, Hank, smiling broadly at the camera, his blue eyes bright with mischief. The back of the photo had the letters LYM, written in Hank's small, untidy scrawl. Laura's throat tightened as she held the photo in her hands, her thumb brushing over the letters. LYM. It had been their little code. "Love you, Mom," Hank would say, in that innocent way that only children can, as though the world had not yet shown him its cruelties. She turned the photo over and smiled softly at the memory. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. Tears threatened to well up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. Now wasn't the time for that. She had a job to do, a new beginning, but Hank's presence would always be with her. She could still hear his voice sometimes, the way he'd call out LYM whenever he ran out the door for school, or when he was playing in the backyard, chasing after their dog. The loss of him was something she carried with her every day, but today she allowed herself to feel a small sense of accomplishment. For him, for Sam, for herself. Laura placed the photo carefully on the desk beside her computer monitor, where she could see it whenever she looked up. She straightened her back and took another steadying breath, letting the cool air of the office fill her lungs. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for Hank, for the memory of him and everything they'd gone through together. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Nancy standing in the doorway, a small, approving smile on her face. "Ready for the tour?" Laura nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Definitely." As they walked back out into the hallways, Nancy pointed out various departments and introduced Laura to a few more people. There was Adam, the slightly awkward but well-meaning man who seemed to perpetually have a pen behind his ear and coffee stains on his shirt. He waved enthusiastically as they passed, his smile wide but nervous, as though he was still getting used to the idea of being in such a high-powered company. And then there was Mindy Dawson, the MRT supervisor who had applied for the same position Laura now held. Mindy's handshake was firm, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Laura could feel the unspoken tension between them, Mindy's disappointment masked by professionalism. It didn't take long for Laura to pick up on the subtle ways Mindy tried to undercut her, small comments and offhand remarks that hinted at Mindy's resentment. But Laura wasn't the type to engage in workplace drama. She had her own battles to fight, and Mindy's issues weren't one of them. The tour ended at a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. The view was breathtaking, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though somewhere in the building, someone was observing her every move. "Mr. Givens usually works remotely," Nancy explained as they stood in the empty room. "But he keeps a close eye on things. You may not see him often, but you'll feel his presence." Laura nodded, though the idea of working for a man who was practically a ghost in his own company felt strange. Everyone spoke of Ross Givens with a kind of reverence, but no one seemed to know him personally. It was as if he were an idea more than a person, someone whose influence could be felt but never truly seen. As they made their way back to her office, Laura's thoughts turned inward once again. She was ready for this challenge, even if part of her still doubted whether she belonged here. But as she walked past the glass walls, seeing her reflection move in and out of focus, she reminded herself why she was here. For Hank. For the future she had promised him, even if he wasn't here to share it with her. Back at her desk, she glanced again at the photo of Hank, her heart swelling with a quiet, unspoken promise. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same calm determination that had carried her this far. "We made it," she whispered again, this time with a little more certainty. Part 2. Meeting the team. Laura settled into the soft leather chair behind her sleek, minimalist desk, glancing once more at the photograph of her son, Hank. The letters LYM on the back felt like an unspoken promise between them, a small but significant reminder of why she was here. After everything, she had made it. She exhaled a deep breath, steeling herself for the day ahead. It was time to meet her team. The office door was still open, and the hum of activity from the workstations outside filtered into her space. A mix of muted conversations, the steady tapping of keyboards, and the occasional ring of a phone. The energy of Givens Corp buzzed around her, and yet, within her own office, there was a quiet sense of calm, as though the glass walls shielded her from the intensity of the world beyond. "All set?" Nancy's voice came from the doorway, pulling Laura from her thoughts. Laura smiled, nodding as she stood up and smoothed out the front of her blouse. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. Nancy beckoned her out of the office, and as they walked toward the open floor area where her team worked, Laura couldn't help but admire the seamless design of the space. Givens Corp was a company that paid attention to details, and the environment reflected that. The open floor plan allowed for collaboration, but the layout still offered a sense of privacy for those deep in thought. There was a method to the design, a balance of focus and creativity, where each employee seemed to have their own corner of the office ecosystem. The walls were adorned with modern art, pieces that weren't just decorative but seemed to reflect the ethos of the company. Bold strokes of color, geometric shapes that hinted at order and chaos all at once. It felt like a place that was always moving forward, evolving, and it filled Laura with both excitement and a slight sense of intimidation. "First up, Adam. He'll be one of the main people you'll work with," Nancy said as they approached a nearby workstation. Adam was hunched over his desk, fingers flying across the keyboard, his eyes narrowed in concentration. His wiry frame seemed almost too small for the oversized desk chair he was sitting in, and his shirt, though crisply ironed, bore the faintest trace of a coffee stain that marred its otherwise clean white surface. His tie was slightly askew, the knot loose as if it had been hastily thrown on at the last minute. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a focused energy about him. "Adam!" Nancy called out, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the office. Adam looked up, startled, his wide brown eyes blinking behind a pair of thick-framed glasses. "Oh, hi, sorry, didn't see you there." His voice was higher-pitched than Laura expected, a bit breathless, as though he had been caught in the middle of something important. Nancy smiled and gestured to Laura. "This is Laura Owens, the new business analyst I told you about. Laura, this is Adam. He handles most of the technical aspects for the market research team. If you need data, reports, or anything crunched, Adam's your guy." Adam stood up so quickly that his chair wheeled back a few feet, bumping lightly against the edge of his desk. He fumbled with his tie for a moment before giving up on straightening it, offering Laura an enthusiastic, if somewhat awkward, handshake. "Welcome, it's great to meet you. I heard about your hire. Big deal. Big deal. You must be excited. Givens Corp is, well, it's Givens Corp, right?" Adam grinned, his eyes shining with what Laura could only describe as nervous energy. Laura returned the handshake with a friendly smile, trying to ease the palpable awkwardness. "Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it's definitely exciting. I'm looking forward to diving in." Adam bobbed his head in agreement. "Oh, you'll love it here. I mean, it's fast-paced for sure. But everyone's great. And the projects? You won't believe the projects. We're working on some really cutting-edge stuff right now with Printice. Big acquisition happening, lots of data to sift through. So if you ever need a breakdown, just let me know." His words tumbled out quickly, like he was trying to get them all out before he lost his train of thought. Laura chuckled softly, already getting the sense that Adam was the type to be lost in his work most of the time, but with a heart in the right place. She could see herself getting along with him. His enthusiasm was contagious, even if it came with a side of awkwardness. "Thanks, I'll definitely take you up on that," she replied warmly. Nancy moved them along, guiding Laura toward the next introduction. "That's Adam for you. A little scattered, but he knows his stuff. When it comes to data, he's one of the best we have." They continued down the row of workstations until they reached a desk at the front of the open floor area, near the reception. Behind it sat a woman with bright red hair, styled into loose waves that framed her face. She was typing away at her computer but looked up the moment they approached, her green eyes lighting up in recognition. "Sharon, this is Laura, our new business analyst," Nancy introduced. Sharon Autumn Davis, the receptionist, stood and extended a hand to Laura. Her smile was warm, with an easy confidence that made Laura feel instantly at ease. Sharon was dressed in a smart navy blue blazer over a cream blouse, her entire look polished yet approachable. "Laura, it's so nice to meet you in person," Sharon said, her voice lively. "I saw your name on the onboarding list. Everyone's been talking about you. Big hire." She gave Laura's hand a firm shake, her grip confident and friendly. Laura was taken aback by how welcoming everyone was. "Thank you, Sharon. I'm still getting used to the idea myself," she said with a slight laugh, feeling the initial jitters start to melt away. Sharon's eyes twinkled with amusement. "You'll be fine. Trust me. You've already impressed a lot of people, and you haven't even met half of us yet. It's a great team here. You'll see." Laura nodded appreciatively, taking in the genuine warmth in Sharon's tone. It was nice to know that, despite the company's high-powered reputation, the people were down-to-earth and approachable. As Sharon settled back into her seat, Nancy turned to Laura with a knowing smile. "Speaking of meeting people, I'm sure you're eager to meet Mr. Givens. He's around. Somewhere." Laura's heart skipped a beat. Nathan Ross Givens, NRG, the legendary founder of Givens Corp. She had heard about him during the interview process, though always in a way that made him seem almost like a myth. Stories of his keen business sense, his ability to spot talent from miles away, his knack for knowing everything that happened in the company, even when he wasn't physically present. But actually meeting him? It felt surreal, like meeting a phantom. "Oh yes, I've heard a lot about Mr. Givens. It'll be great to meet him," Laura said, trying to keep her voice casual, even though the prospect of meeting the elusive founder made her pulse quicken. Nancy chuckled softly. "You and everyone else. He's a bit of a ghost around here. You'll know he's been in the office because people mention it in passing, but you might not actually see him yourself." Laura raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that so? I've heard he's pretty hands-on with the business." Sharon chimed in from her desk, glancing up from her computer. "Oh, he is. Very much so. But he has this way of slipping in and out without most people realizing. I swear he must have a secret entrance or something. One minute, you'll hear someone say, 'Oh, I just saw Ross.' And the next, he's vanished." Laura laughed, though she felt a pang of disappointment. "So, I might be working here for a while before I actually meet him?" Nancy shrugged, a wry smile playing on her lips. "If you're lucky, you'll catch him at the right time. If not, well, you'll hear about him from everyone else. That's how it goes here." Laura couldn't help but feel both amused and slightly frustrated by the idea. She had hoped that maybe today, her first day, would be the day she'd meet the man whose name was on everything, whose influence permeated the entire company. But as she quickly learned, nothing was ever that straightforward at Givens Corp. As Nancy continued introducing her to more team members, Brittany from Constituent Analytics, Peter from Finance, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not in a sinister way, but more like being part of something larger, something carefully orchestrated. The employees moved with purpose, yet there was an underlying ease in their movements, as though they were part of a well-rehearsed dance. Everyone seemed to know their role, their place in the grand scheme of things. Everyone but her, it seemed. Still, as the day wore on, Laura found herself warming to the team. Each new introduction a reminder that she was no longer on the outside looking in. She was part of this now. Part of Givens Corp. Part of its story. Just before lunch, she had one last meeting lined up, a chance to meet Ross Givens himself. Nancy had mentioned he was scheduled to be in the building for an executive meeting, and Laura felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest. Maybe today was the day after all. As she made her way to the executive floor with Nancy, her heart thudded with anticipation. They reached the conference room, but as the door swung open, Laura's stomach dropped. Empty. The room was empty, save for a few scattered folders and papers on the table. "Oh," Nancy said with a sigh, glancing at her phone. "Looks like Ross had to step out for a last-minute call." Laura pressed her lips together, trying to hide her disappointment. "Guess I missed him," she said, though the words came out more flatly than she had intended. Nancy smiled apologetically. "It happens to the best of us. But don't worry, Laura. You'll meet him soon enough. Like I said, he's around. Somewhere." Laura couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. It was only her first day, and already she felt like she was chasing a phantom. "Well, I'll be ready for him whenever he decides to show up," she said, smiling through the frustration. Nancy gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. That's the spirit. Chapter 2. Office Introductions. Part 1. Meeting Mindy, Allison, Dawson. The day had already started to feel like a whirlwind. After a series of introductions and learning the ropes of her new role at Givens Corp, Laura was starting to feel the weight of everything settling in. The office environment was buzzing with a quiet intensity, a well-oiled machine humming along as each person played their part in the grand production that was Givens Corp. As Laura made her way back to her office, her thoughts swirled around the multitude of faces and names she had met earlier in the day. Adam with his scatterbrained enthusiasm, Sharon with her easy warmth, Nancy's efficient yet supportive guidance. She was trying to remember everyone, but with so much happening at once, it felt like trying to catch water in her hands. She was just about to sit at her desk when Nancy appeared in the doorway, her hand raised in a small wave. "Laura, I've got someone I want you to meet," Nancy said, her voice calm but purposeful. "This is Mindy Dawson. She's one of the MRT supervisors. You two will be working together quite a bit." Laura felt a shift in the air almost immediately. Mindy Allison Dawson stood in the doorway just behind Nancy, arms crossed over her chest, her posture radiating cool confidence. Her sharp, hazel eyes assessed Laura with a level of scrutiny that was anything but subtle. Mindy had the kind of presence that drew attention. Tall, lean, and impeccably dressed in a tailored black blazer over a crisp white blouse. Everything about her appearance screamed polished professionalism, right down to the flawless high bun that crowned her head like a helmet. "Laura," Nancy began, stepping aside to allow Mindy into the room. "Mindy was in the running for your position before you came on board. We're lucky to have both of you as part of the team now." "Nice to meet you," Laura said, extending her hand with a friendly smile. She could feel the tension already, like static in the air before a storm. She wasn't sure why, but there was something in Mindy's eyes that made her feel uneasy, something hard and unforgiving behind the polite facade. Mindy took her hand, but her grip was firm to the point of discomfort. "You too," she said, her voice smooth, almost too controlled. "I've heard a lot about you." There was an edge to her tone that Laura couldn't quite place. She withdrew her hand, trying to keep her smile steady. "Thanks. I've heard good things about you too." Mindy raised one perfectly arched eyebrow. "I'm sure you have." Nancy, seemingly unaware of the tension brewing between the two women, clasped her hands together with a satisfied nod. "I'll leave you both to it then. I know you have a lot to go over." With that, she exited the office, leaving Laura and Mindy alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Mindy's eyes flickered around the room, taking in every detail. The way Laura's desk was already neatly organized, the photo of her son positioned prominently by her monitor, the way Laura stood just slightly off-center, as if still trying to find her place in this new environment. Finally, Mindy broke the silence with a soft, almost dismissive chuckle. "You certainly settled in quickly," she remarked, her voice laced with something that sounded suspiciously like condescension. Laura felt a prickle of irritation but kept her expression neutral. She wasn't here to get involved in any office drama, especially not on her first day. "It's been a busy morning," she replied evenly, choosing not to engage with the subtle dig. There's a lot to take in. Mindy nodded, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a calculatedness to the way she studied Laura. Well, if you need help navigating anything around here, let me know. I've been with Givens Corp for years. I know how things work. Laura sensed the unspoken message beneath the offer. I know more than you do. You're the newcomer here, and I was supposed to be in your position. She had no doubt that Mindy's experience was valuable, but it was clear that Mindy saw her as competition, not a colleague. Thanks, I appreciate that, Laura said, keeping her tone polite. I'm sure there's a lot I can learn from you. Mindy's smile was tight, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes flashed with something darker. Resentment, perhaps, or maybe something more personal. I'm sure you'll catch on, eventually. The words hung in the air, just long enough to make Laura feel the sting. She wasn't imagining things. Mindy was definitely trying to assert dominance here, to remind Laura that she had been next in line for the position and that Laura's arrival had disrupted her plans. Laura's stomach tightened with discomfort, but she refused to let it show. She'd dealt with people like Mindy before, people who used subtle jabs and passive-aggressive remarks to undermine others. But Laura had also learned over the years that the best way to deal with someone like that was to not engage, to stay professional, and not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I'm looking forward to working with you, Laura said, her voice steady. Mindy's smile didn't waver, but there was no warmth in it. We'll see. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out of Laura's office, leaving a lingering tension in the air that Laura could practically taste. She stood there for a moment, staring after Mindy, trying to shake off the strange unease that had settled over her. She sank back into her chair, the leather creaking slightly under her weight, and took a slow breath. This was not how she had envisioned her first day going. She had expected nerves, maybe some excitement. But this was something else. The office environment suddenly felt a little less welcoming, a little more hostile. Laura leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. Mindy was in the running for your position. Nancy's words echoed in her head. She hadn't known that. It explained a lot, really. Mindy's coldness, the subtle digs, the way she had tried to assert herself as the more experienced, more deserving candidate. It's not personal, Laura reminded herself. She wanted this job, and she didn't get it. She's just bitter. Still, it was hard not to take it personally. Laura had worked hard to get here, and while she understood competition, she hadn't expected to walk into an environment where she was already facing subtle sabotage on her first day. As the minutes ticked by, Laura decided to shake it off. She couldn't afford to get distracted by office politics, not when she had so much to prove. Mindy could play her games, but Laura wasn't going to get caught up in them. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well. She glanced down at her desk, her eyes falling on the photo of Hank. His bright, smiling face brought a sense of calm over her, grounding her in the moment. Focus on what matters, she told herself. Focus on why you're here. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock on her open door. She looked up to see Adam standing there, holding a stack of papers in one hand and looking slightly out of breath. Hey, Laura, he said, offering her a sheepish smile. I thought I'd bring these over to you. Some reports from the market research team that might help you get up to speed. Thanks, Adam, Laura said, grateful for the distraction. She motioned for him to come in. I could definitely use the help. Adam stepped inside, setting the papers on her desk. No problem. I remember my first week here. Felt like I was drowning in paperwork. But you'll get the hang of it. Just takes time. Laura appreciated Adam's sincerity. He wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't playing any games. He was just Adam. Earnest, a little awkward, but genuine. It was a refreshing change of pace after her tense interaction with Mindy. Thanks, Laura said again, flipping through the stack of papers. I'm still trying to get my bearings, but I think I'm starting to find my rhythm. Adam nodded, his glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose as he smiled. Yeah, once you get the lay of the land, it's not so bad. But if you ever need anything, just let me know. Seriously. Laura felt a surge of gratitude. I will. I appreciate it, Adam. As Adam left her office, Laura turned her attention back to the reports in front of her. The numbers swam before her eyes for a moment before she managed to focus. This was her world now. Data, reports, analysis. And she would prove herself, no matter what Mindy or anyone else thought. The afternoon passed in a blur of numbers and figures, the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard punctuating the silence in her office. As the hours wore on, the knot of tension in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a growing sense of determination. Mindy might be a problem, but Laura wasn't going to let that stop her from succeeding. She would focus on her work, build relationships with her team, and carve out her place in Givens Corp, one step at a time. By the time Laura glanced at the clock, it was late afternoon, and the office had settled into a quiet hum. She gathered her things, preparing to head home for the day. As she stood, she caught sight of Mindy in the distance, talking to another colleague near the break room. Their eyes met briefly, and for a second, Laura thought she saw a flicker of something in Mindy's expression, something like doubt, or maybe regret. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cool indifference that had marked their earlier conversation. Laura squared her shoulders and walked past without a word, her chin held high. She didn't need Mindy's approval, nor did she intend to seek it. The elevator doors slid open, and Laura stepped inside, watching as the doors closed on the office floor behind her. The tension of the day melted away as the elevator descended, and by the time she stepped out into the lobby, she felt lighter. Givens Corp was a challenge, no doubt about it. But Laura had faced challenges before, and she would face this one head-on. As she pushed open the glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, Laura allowed herself a small, determined smile. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even Mindy Dawson, stand in her way. Part 2. The First Project and Missed Connections. The soft hum of the office buzzed around Laura as she sat at her desk, poring over the files for her first project. The glow of the computer screen illuminated her face in the dim afternoon light filtering in through the tall windows of Givens Corp. Papers were spread across her desk, each one carefully annotated with her initial thoughts and questions. Despite the fact that it was her first real task in the company, Laura had slipped into work mode quickly, her analytical mind dissecting the information in front of her with precision. The project was connected to Printice International's latest acquisition, a complex deal involving the purchase of a mid-sized printer manufacturer called HADS. Laura's role was to assist in the data analysis and help present the research findings that would support the acquisition strategy. It was exactly the kind of work she excelled at, digging into the numbers, making sense of the data, and presenting a clear, logical case. But no matter how focused she tried to be, something kept pulling her attention away. It wasn't the intricate details of the project or the occasional email ping from Adam's end of the floor. No, it was the constant chatter about someone Laura had yet to meet, the elusive Ross Givens. The name had become a refrain in her new workplace, like a melody stuck in her head. Every time she passed someone in the hall or overheard a conversation in the break room, there it was again. Ross this, Ross that. It was strange, almost eerie. People spoke about Ross Givens like he was both omnipresent and yet never around. It seemed that everyone had regular interactions with him, everyone except her. Laura leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of her first day bearing down on her shoulders. She could hear voices just outside her office door, which she had left slightly ajar. Curious, she tilted her head to listen without trying to appear too obvious. Julie Stiles Thompson's unmistakable voice drifted through the small gap in the door. Laura had been introduced to Julie briefly earlier that day. She was the lead at Printice International, one of the key players in the ongoing acquisition. Julie had a commanding presence, someone who exuded authority effortlessly, but without arrogance. She was the kind of person Laura admired, successful, but approachable. "I caught Ross just before he left the office," Julie was saying, her tone casual, as if it were no big deal to catch one of the most powerful men in the company as he was heading out. "We talked about the Printice integration, and he seemed pretty optimistic about it. He mentioned that the financials were all lining up nicely." Another voice chimed in, one Laura didn't recognize immediately. "Yeah, I saw him earlier too. He was over by HR, talking to Janet about the new hires. I swear that man never misses a beat. How does he do it?" Laura's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. Again? Ross had been in the office, and she had somehow missed him. Again. It had only been her first day, but it was starting to feel like a running joke. She had been here since early morning, meeting colleagues, settling into her new role, and navigating the maze that was Givens Corp's culture. But every time she thought she might get a glimpse of Ross Givens, he had already slipped away. How does everyone else see him so easily? She thought, a touch of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It's like he's purposely avoiding me. Not that she believed that was actually the case, of course. Ross Givens had no reason to avoid her specifically, but the sheer improbability of it all was beginning to wear on her nerves. How had she managed to be in the office all day without so much as a fleeting encounter with him, while everyone else seemed to be tripping over him at every turn? Shaking her head, Laura returned her focus to the files in front of her, though her concentration was beginning to slip. She scrolled through the financial reports for the Printice acquisition, trying to lose herself in the familiar terrain of numbers and analysis. But the chatter outside her office persisted, and soon enough, she found herself caught up in their conversation once again. I swear Ross is like a ninja, Julie's voice continued, followed by a soft chuckle. You never hear him coming, and then, boom, he's right there. There was more laughter from the group. Laura couldn't help but crack a smile, despite her growing frustration. It was almost comical how this man, who ran the company, managed to elude her so effortlessly while leaving a trail of sightings in his wake. Suddenly, a knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. Laura looked up to see Adam standing in the doorway, his typical slightly disheveled appearance accompanied by an apologetic smile. His shirt was untucked on one side, and he held a stack of folders under one arm, the top of which threatened to slide off at any moment. Hey Laura, he said, pushing his glasses back up his nose. I've got those reports from MRT you asked for. Thanks, Adam, Laura replied, motioning for him to come in. She shuffled some papers aside on her desk to make room for the folders he was carrying. As Adam dropped the stack onto her desk with a thud, he glanced around the office, taking in the sight of her meticulously organized workspace. Man, you've really settled in, huh? It took me like 3 weeks to get my desk this organized, he said, half joking but clearly impressed. Laura chuckled, appreciating the lightheartedness. I'm just trying to stay on top of things. I know there's a lot coming my way. Adam nodded earnestly. Oh, for sure. It can get pretty intense around here. But you'll be fine. You've already made a good impression, I think. Laura raised an eyebrow. Have I? Adam grinned, leaning against the edge of her desk. Yeah, everyone's been talking about you. Especially Ross. Laura's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Ross's name. Of course, she thought. Even Ross is talking about me, someone I haven't even met yet. It was beginning to feel absurd. Really? Laura said, keeping her tone casual despite the exasperation bubbling up inside her. I haven't even seen him all day. I thought I might get a chance to meet him by now. Oh yeah, Adam said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He was here earlier, walking through the main office. He had a meeting with Julie, I think. You didn't see him? Laura tried to hide her growing disbelief. No, I guess I missed him. Adam shrugged, his expression innocent. Yeah, he comes and goes pretty quickly. But don't worry, you'll catch him eventually. He's around a lot more than people realize. Laura smiled, but it was tight, her patience wearing thin. I hope so, she said, keeping her tone light. I'd hate for it to become a habit, missing him every time he's here. Adam laughed, clearly oblivious to the frustrations simmering beneath her words. Yeah, that'd be something. Anyway, let me know if you need anything else. I'm just a few desks away. Will do, thanks Adam, Laura replied, watching as he shuffled out of her office, already engrossed in whatever was on the next page of his report. Once Adam was gone, Laura let out a long sigh, leaning back in her chair and staring up at the ceiling. It was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. Everyone in this building had seen Ross Givens at least once today, and yet here she was, still waiting for her first glimpse of the man whose company she now worked for. Her thoughts were interrupted once again by the chatter outside her door. This time, it was a different group of colleagues, their voices low but animated. I bumped into Ross in the elevator this morning, one of them said. He's so laid back, you wouldn't think he runs the whole show. Right? I saw him in the cafe last week. He was just sitting there drinking his coffee like a regular guy. Laura gritted her teeth. It was becoming a game now. How many people can mention seeing Ross Givens today without me ever meeting him? She stood up from her desk, pushing her chair back with a soft creak. She needed a break, some fresh air, or at least a change of scenery. Grabbing her phone and her notes, she headed toward the break room, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she'd run into Ross on her way there. The hallways of Givens Corp were quiet as she walked, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that lined the floors. The walls were adorned with sleek modern art, pieces that blended abstract shapes and muted colors into a seamless part of the office's aesthetic. It was all very chic, very high-end, but it only added to the sense of distance Laura was starting to feel from the elusive world of Ross Givens. As she approached the break room, she could hear laughter from inside. Pushing the door open, she stepped into the brightly lit space, where a few of her colleagues were gathered around the coffee machine, chatting and laughing over their afternoon caffeine fixes. Julie was there too, leaning casually against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. She smiled when she saw Laura enter. "Hey, Laura," Julie greeted her, raising her cup in a friendly salute. "How's your first day going?" Laura forced a smile, though she could feel her frustration gnawing at the edges of her composure. "It's going well. Just trying to get up to speed on the Printice project." Julie nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "You'll catch on quickly, I'm sure. It's a lot to juggle at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward." Laura nodded, not entirely trusting herself to speak. She glanced around the break room, half expecting to see Ross Givens casually sitting at one of the tables, sipping a cup of coffee like everyone else had described. But of course, he wasn't there. Julie must have noticed the look on her face, because she raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Still haven't met Ross, huh?" Laura sighed, leaning against the counter next to her. "Nope. I've been in the office all day, and somehow I've managed to miss him every time." Julie chuckled, her expression sympathetic. "Don't worry, it happens. Ross is... well, he's Ross. He's always around, but never where you expect him to be." Laura laughed softly, though the frustration was still bubbling beneath the surface. At this point, it's starting to feel like a joke. Everyone else has seen him but me. Julie's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well, you'll meet him eventually. It's inevitable." Laura wasn't so sure. As she stood there in the break room, surrounded by colleagues who all seemed to have had at least one casual encounter with Ross Givens, she couldn't help but feel like she was being left out of some inside joke. But then again, maybe that was just the nature of Givens Corp, a place where everyone was always one step ahead, and she was still trying to catch up. For now, all she could do was laugh along with the rest of them. Chapter 3. Printice Project. Part 1. Assignment and Preparation. Laura sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen, her eyes scanning the words slowly as if to absorb their full weight. She had just been assigned to the Printice project, one of the most important deals Givens Corp was handling. Printice International, a renowned custom printing company, was in the process of acquiring HADS, a mid-sized printer manufacturer, and Laura was expected to contribute her analytical skills to help with the acquisition strategy. The news had come unexpectedly. Laura had barely settled into her role, and here she was, about to be thrust into the middle of a high-stakes corporate deal. It was exhilarating, to say the least, but beneath the excitement was a flutter of anxiety. This was her first major task at Givens Corp, and she couldn't afford to mess it up. She sat up straighter in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of her keyboard. Nancy had just walked her through the initial details of the project, but the true challenge lay ahead. The more she thought about it, the more Laura realized that this wasn't just another project. It was a test of her abilities, her adaptability, and perhaps even her place within Givens Corp. Laura's office, though still new to her, felt like a sanctuary. The clean lines of the modern furniture, the soft gray carpet beneath her feet, and the expansive window that bathed the room in natural light, all seemed to calm her nerves. Outside, the hum of the office continued, a steady rhythm of phone calls, keyboard clicks, and the occasional muted conversation filtering through the glass walls. It was a high-powered environment, but it was also one of focus and precision, a place where people came to get things done. With a deep breath, Laura leaned forward and began organizing her notes. The details of the Printice Had's acquisition swirled in her mind. Financial reports, market analysis, personnel assessments. She was scheduled to meet with Janet, the HR director at Printice, to discuss the potential staffing implications of the deal. There was a lot to consider: how Had's employees would be integrated, whether there would be redundancies, and how to manage the cultural differences between the two companies. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to dive into the data, but before she could begin, a soft knock at her door pulled her attention. "Come in," she called, looking up from her screen. Nancy stepped into the office, her expression calm but purposeful as always. In her hand, she carried a sleek tablet, its screen already glowing with information. "Hey, Laura," she said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from Laura's desk. "I just wanted to go over some of the finer points of the Printice project with you, before your meeting with Janet." "Of course," Laura replied, shifting her chair slightly to give Nancy her full attention. "I was just about to dive into the reports." Nancy nodded, tapping a few times on her tablet before sliding it across the desk toward Laura. "There's a lot to cover, but I've highlighted the key areas you should focus on for now. You'll have access to the full financials, but the main concern right now is the staffing plan for the merger. Printice will want to keep most of Had's senior staff, but we're anticipating some overlap in middle management, which could lead to redundancies." Laura glanced down at the tablet, her eyes scanning the names and positions listed on the screen. It was a delicate balance, ensuring that Had's employees felt secure in their roles while also streamlining operations to fit Printice's business model. She made a mental note to discuss this with Janet during their meeting. "And how's Janet to work with?" Laura asked, looking up at Nancy. Nancy smiled, her expression softening slightly. "Janet's great, very straightforward and no nonsense. She knows what she's doing, and she's been with Printice for years, so she's seen it all. But she's also protective of her team, so just be prepared for some pushback if you suggest any major changes." "Got it," Laura said, nodding as she took a few notes on a nearby notepad. "I'll tread carefully." Nancy leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "You'll be fine, Laura. You've got a good head on your shoulders, and you're already making a strong impression. Just stick to the data, and you'll do great." Laura smiled, grateful for Nancy's vote of confidence, though a part of her still felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just any project. This was her chance to prove herself in a company where excellence was the baseline. "And I assume Ross Givens will be at the meeting as well?" Laura asked, trying to keep her voice casual even though the mention of Ross's name sent a ripple of anticipation through her. She had heard so much about him but had yet to actually meet him. It was starting to feel like some kind of cosmic joke. Nancy nodded. "Yes, Ross should be there, along with Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printice. This is a big deal for both companies, and Ross likes to be hands-on with these kinds of acquisitions." Laura's heart gave a small flutter at the mention of Ross and Bradley in the same breath. Bradley Hendricks was another name she had heard whispered around the office, a man known for his sharp business acumen and relentless drive. The idea of being in the same room with both Ross and Bradley felt like a baptism by fire. But this was what she had signed up for, wasn't it? This was the world of Givens Corp, where high stakes and high pressure were the norm. "When's the meeting?" Laura asked, mentally bracing herself. Nancy checked her tablet again. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. You'll have time to review everything tonight and make any last-minute adjustments in the morning. I've already sent you the agenda." "Thanks, Nancy," Laura said, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness settle in her chest. "I'll be ready." With a final nod, Nancy stood and made her way to the door. "I'll let you get back to it. Let me know if you need anything." As soon as the door closed behind her, Laura exhaled deeply, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. She glanced at the clock, still plenty of time to review the reports before the end of the day. But the magnitude of the task before her felt more real now, more immediate. She picked up the tablet Nancy had left and began scrolling through the data. There was a lot to digest: financial projections, market trends, workforce assessments. Laura's analytical mind began to pick apart the numbers, making connections, identifying potential risks and opportunities. This was where she excelled, where she found her groove. The numbers didn't intimidate her. They spoke to her in a language she understood. But beneath the surface of her professional focus, there was a nagging thought that kept pulling at her. Ross Givens. Would tomorrow finally be the day she met him? Would she finally see the man behind the legend, the one who everyone seemed to encounter effortlessly except for her? She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. There was no point in obsessing over it. If it happened, it happened. For now, she had a job to do. Several hours passed in a blur of data and notes. By the time Laura finally looked up from her work, the office had quieted down, the once bustling energy now replaced with the soft hum of computers and the occasional click of a keyboard. Most of her colleagues had left for the day, but Laura had stayed late, determined to be as prepared as possible for the meeting tomorrow. As she stretched her stiff muscles and gathered her things, she glanced out the window, the city lights twinkling against the darkening sky. It was a beautiful view, one that made her feel both small and significant at the same time. She was just one person in a vast, complex world, but here she was, part of something bigger than herself. The next morning arrived with the same sense of anticipation that had been building since Laura had first been assigned to the Printice project. She arrived at the office early, the cool morning air still clinging to her skin as she made her way through the quiet hallways of Givens Corp. There was a stillness in the air, a calm before the storm, and Laura found herself grateful for the silence. She reviewed her notes one last time, her mind racing through the key points she wanted to address in the meeting. The financial data was solid, but there were a few areas where she anticipated pushback, particularly when it came to staffing and potential redundancies. Janet would likely be protective of her team at Printice, and Laura would need to navigate that conversation carefully. By 9:45 a.m., Laura was standing outside the conference room, her nerves humming with a quiet energy. She had dressed with extra care that morning, an immaculately tailored navy suit and a silk blouse in a soft cream color. She wanted to project confidence and professionalism, even if her heart was pounding beneath her calm exterior. The conference room itself was a testament to Givens Corp's sleek, modern aesthetic. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, offering a panoramic view of the city below. The long, polished table in the center of the room was flanked by high-backed leather chairs, each one perfectly spaced as though the entire setup had been designed with precision. Laura took a seat near the head of the table, laying out her tablet and notes in front of her. She glanced at the empty chairs around her, wondering which one Ross Givens would occupy, if he would even show up at all. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Janet, the HR director from Printice, walked in. She was a tall, statuesque woman, with a no-nonsense air about her. Her gray hair pulled back into a sleek chignon. Her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the room before landing on Laura. "You must be Laura Owens," Janet said, extending her hand in a firm handshake. "I've heard good things about you." Laura stood to greet her, returning the handshake with equal firmness. "Thank you, Janet. I've heard a lot about you as well. It's great to finally meet." Janet smiled, though there was a guardedness to it, a professional distance that Laura recognized. This was a woman who had been through mergers and acquisitions before, and she wasn't here to make friends. She was here to protect her team and ensure that Printice came out of this deal in the best possible position. As they exchanged pleasantries, the door opened again, and Laura's breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she thought, "This is it." But it wasn't Ross. It was Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printice. Bradley was a tall, imposing figure, his presence commanding attention as soon as he entered the room. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his sharp blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, the kind that spoke of quiet wealth and power. "Good morning," Bradley said, his voice deep and authoritative as he shook hands with Laura and Janet. "Let's get started, shall we?" The meeting began smoothly, with Laura presenting the key points of her analysis and Janet offering feedback from Printice's perspective. As the discussion turned to staffing and redundancies, Laura could feel the tension in the room rise. Janet was, as expected, protective of her team, but Laura navigated the conversation carefully, emphasizing the importance of retaining HADS's key personnel while also streamlining operations. But as the meeting went on, one question lingered in the back of Laura's mind. Where was Ross? She couldn't help but glance at the empty chair across from her, wondering if he would ever show up. Every now and then, Bradley would glance at his phone, as though he were waiting for someone, but Ross never appeared. When the meeting finally ended, Laura felt a mix of satisfaction and frustration. She had done her job well, but once again, Ross Givens remained elusive. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Janet gave her a nod of approval. You handled yourself well today, Laura. I think you'll do just fine here. Laura smiled, grateful for the compliment, but the nagging sense of having missed something, or someone, remained. Maybe next time, she thought, as she walked out of the conference room. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ross Givens would continue to slip through her fingers, just out of reach, like a phantom moving through the halls of Givens Corp. Part 2. The Missing Ross Givens. Laura sat at her desk the next morning, a mixture of excitement and nerves running through her as she glanced once more at her notes for the upcoming meeting. Today, she was finally going to meet Ross Givens, the founder of Givens Corp., the man whose name carried a weight that reverberated through every corner of the office, the elusive figure who, despite working in the same building as her for over a week, remained a ghost in her life. She felt like today would finally break the absurd cycle of missed encounters that had become something of a running joke. Every time she asked about Ross, it seemed like she had just missed him. Sharon from reception had casually mentioned seeing him grab coffee just after Laura had left the break room. Adam had bumped into him in the elevator, exchanging a few words about the latest financial report, while Laura had been buried in paperwork. Even Nancy had spoken about passing him in the hall on her way to the restroom. It seemed like everyone had interacted with him except Laura, as though the universe itself was conspiring to keep them apart. But today would be different. The meeting was set for 11 a.m., and Laura was ready. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of the Printice project, her head filled with financial data, staffing concerns, and market projections. She had prepared talking points, anticipated questions, and even rehearsed what she would say when she finally met Ross. She wanted to make a good impression, not just as a competent business analyst, but as someone who belonged here, at Givens Corp., handling the kind of high-stakes projects that could make or break a company. Meeting Ross Givens felt like a rite of passage, one that she'd been anticipating since her first day. Laura glanced at her watch. It was 10:30, just enough time to do one final review before heading to the conference room. She straightened the stack of papers on her desk, smoothing out any errant corners. Her nerves fluttered slightly, but she breathed deeply, centering herself. She could handle this. She was ready. She stood, feeling the soft give of the plush carpet beneath her feet as she slipped into her blazer and grabbed her tablet. The polished chrome fixtures and glass walls of the office reflected the glow of the mid-morning sunlight, casting sharp, angular shadows across the floor. The hum of quiet conversations and the faint clicking of keyboards filled the air, a symphony of productivity that was strangely soothing. As she made her way to the elevator, she passed a few of her colleagues who offered nods and smiles of encouragement. Adam waved enthusiastically from his desk, his tie slightly askew as usual, but his grin was as wide as ever. He mouthed something like, "Good luck," though it was hard to tell with his half-chewed pen still dangling from his mouth. Laura smiled back, feeling a small surge of gratitude for the camaraderie of her team. Despite the intensity of the work environment, there was a sense of support here. People genuinely wanted each other to succeed. The elevator ride up to the executive floor was smooth, almost unnervingly quiet, and as the doors slid open with a soft chime, Laura stepped into the corridor that led to the main conference room. She could already feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just any meeting. It was a pivotal moment in her career, a chance to prove herself to the key players in the company, Ross Givens included. The executive floor was as sleek and modern as the rest of the building, with minimalist decor that exuded both sophistication and power. Artful lighting fixtures cast soft glows against the deep gray walls, and the scent of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee hung faintly in the air. Every detail here felt intentional, as if designed to remind you that you were in the heart of Givens Corp., where decisions worth millions were made every day. Laura approached the conference room door, her heart beating just a little faster as she placed her hand on the cool metal handle. She took one last breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. The room was as impressive as she remembered from the previous day, with its expansive glass windows offering a stunning view of the city skyline. The long table was already set for the meeting, with water glasses and tablets arranged neatly at each seat. Janet, the HR director from Printice, was already there, seated at the far end of the table, her back to the window. She looked up as Laura entered and offered a nod of acknowledgement. "Morning, Laura," Janet said, her voice clipped but not unfriendly. Janet was always composed, professional to the core, and it was clear she had been through plenty of high-level meetings like this one. Her cool demeanor made Laura want to match her professionalism. Cool, calm, and prepared. "Morning, Janet," Laura replied, walking over to the seat nearest to her and placing her tablet on the table. "I'm looking forward to today's discussion." They exchanged a few more words, mostly small talk about the logistics of the Printice acquisition and the staffing strategies they would discuss today. Laura felt her nerves begin to settle as they talked. This was familiar territory for her. The numbers, the analysis, the problem-solving. That was her world. She knew the Printice project inside and out. By 10:55, a few more people had filtered into the room, including Bradley Hendricks, the CEO of Printice International. Bradley, with his salt and pepper hair and steel blue eyes, commanded attention as soon as he walked in. His presence was sharp, like a blade slicing through the air, and he had a way of making even small talk feel like a strategic maneuver. He greeted everyone with a nod, his posture straight and authoritative, but his eyes always seemed to be scanning the room, sizing up each person. Laura felt a small thrill of excitement. This was it. Everyone was here. All that was left was Ross Givens. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 11 a.m. on the dot. The room grew quiet as the clock ticked past the hour. Laura could feel the anticipation building, a quiet hum beneath the surface as they all waited for Ross to arrive. Her fingers tapped lightly on her tablet as she reviewed her notes one last time, mentally rehearsing her introduction. She would shake his hand, introduce herself, and confidently present her analysis of the project. Any minute now? The door opened, and Laura's heart leapt in her chest. She looked up, expecting to see Ross Givens finally walk into the room. But it wasn't Ross. It was Nancy, and the look on her face told Laura everything she needed to know. Nancy stepped into the room, her expression apologetic as she approached the table. "I'm sorry, everyone," she said, her voice low but clear. "Ross won't be able to make it today. He had a last-minute call with one of our overseas partners that couldn't be rescheduled." Laura's heart sank. Of course, she thought, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course Ross can't make it. It was almost laughable at this point. Here she was, once again ready to finally meet the man whose name had become a constant refrain in her life, only to be thwarted by some last-minute change. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep her frustration from showing on her face. Everyone else in the room seemed unfazed, as if this were just another day in the life of Givens Corp. "Oh well," Janet said with a shrug, her voice casual as she adjusted the papers in front of her. "We can always catch up with Ross later. He's good about checking in when he can." Bradley didn't seem too perturbed either, merely nodding in agreement. "No problem. We can proceed without him. Laura, why don't you start with your analysis of the workforce integration?" Laura forced a smile, feeling a wave of exasperation wash over her. She could hardly believe how nonchalant everyone was. How often does this happen? She wondered, though she knew the answer. It probably happened all the time. Everyone else seemed to meet Ross in passing, but for her, it was becoming an endless game of cat and mouse. "Of course," Laura said, standing and tapping her tablet to bring up the data she had meticulously prepared. She launched into her presentation, her voice steady despite the lingering frustration. She walked them through the key points of her analysis, the staffing needs, the potential redundancies, the cultural differences between Printice and HADS that would need to be addressed. She spoke with confidence, feeling the weight of her expertise guiding her through the discussion. But in the back of her mind, the thought lingered. Where is Ross Givens? As Laura wrapped up her presentation, she glanced at the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair where Ross was supposed to sit. It was almost as if his absence had become a character in the room, something everyone acknowledged but no one dwelled on. For the others, it seemed like business as usual, but for Laura, it felt like she had been left waiting at the altar. Again. The meeting continued without a hitch, and by the time it ended, Laura had received positive feedback from both Janet and Bradley. They were impressed with her analysis and appreciated her thoroughness. She had done everything right, everything she was supposed to do, but still, that small, hollow feeling remained. It was as if something had been missing from the day, something vital. As they gathered their things and made their way out of the conference room, Laura overheard Bradley and Janet talking in low voices. "Ross really does need to meet her," Bradley was saying. "She's sharp. He'd be impressed." Janet nodded. "He will. She'll run into him eventually. Everyone does." Laura sighed inwardly as she walked behind them. Eventually. That word hung in the air like a tease. Everyone seemed so certain that her time would come, that she would eventually meet the elusive Ross Givens. But right now, it felt like chasing a shadow, one that always slipped away just when she thought she was close enough to catch it. As Laura headed back to her office, she couldn't help but chuckle softly to herself. It was ridiculous. The whole thing was becoming a farce, a comedy of errors. Every day she missed Ross by minutes, sometimes seconds, while everyone else talked about him like they were old friends. It was like she was cursed, a curse that no one else seemed to share. Sinking into her chair, Laura shook her head and allowed herself a moment of exasperation. At least she could laugh about it. After all, it wasn't like Ross was avoiding her on purpose. Was he? She glanced out the window, the city sprawling out below her, alive with movement and purpose. Somewhere out there, Ross Givens was making deals, taking calls, steering the ship that was Givens Corp. And one day, maybe soon, she would finally meet him. But until then, Laura would have to content herself with the knowledge that in a company as large and complex as this, even the most powerful man could be hard to pin down. With a sigh, she turned back to her computer, already preparing for the next phase of the Printice project. She had work to do, and she wasn't going to let the ghost of Ross Givens distract her any longer, at least not until the next meeting. Chapter 4. Melly. Part 1. Life at the Blind School. The air was thick with the scent of pine as Melly stepped out of the dormitory, her cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. Though she couldn't see the towering trees that surrounded the school, she could feel their presence, their needles brushing against the cool breeze, the soft whisper of leaves in the distance, the faint echo that bounced back from the trunks when she clicked her tongue softly against the roof of her mouth. Melly had learned long ago that the world was still there for her, even if she couldn't see it. She didn't need her eyes. The subtle vibrations in the earth, the rush of air on her skin, and the way sounds bounced off surfaces were more than enough to give her a complete picture of her surroundings. She had mastered the art of echolocation, and in doing so, she had mastered her world. "Good morning, Melly," a cheerful voice called out from across the courtyard. Melly's head tilted slightly toward the voice, and she smiled as she raised her cane in greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Larson," she replied. Mrs. Larson had been one of the first people to welcome her when she had arrived at the blind school years ago, and her voice was always a source of comfort to Melly. It was rich and warm, like a favorite blanket wrapped around her on a cold night. As Mrs. Larson's footsteps approached, Melly shifted her weight slightly, listening to the familiar cadence of the teacher's stride. There was a slight limp in Mrs. Larson's walk, the result of an old injury, and Melly had learned to recognize it. It was one of the many details that filled her world with texture and meaning, even in the absence of sight. "How's my favorite student doing this morning?" Mrs. Larson asked, stopping just in front of Melly. She placed a gentle hand on Melly's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both affection and encouragement. "I'm ready," Melly replied with a grin, her head tilted upward. Though she couldn't see Mrs. Larson's face, she could picture it clearly. The kind, crinkled eyes, the soft, motherly smile. "What are we working on today?" Mrs. Larson chuckled softly. "Oh, we've got plenty on the agenda today. But first, let's head to class. I'm sure you don't want to be late." Melly tapped her cane once more, feeling the vibrations ripple through the ground beneath her. She mapped out her surroundings in her mind. There was the dormitory behind her, the school building to her right, and the large oak tree that stood just off the main path, its branches stretching wide like arms welcoming her into the day. She'd walked this path 1,000 times before, but each time felt like a new discovery. The world was constantly shifting, even if the landmarks remained the same. The School for the Blind, officially named the Wendell Academy for the Blind, was nestled in a quiet, forested area far from the noise of the city. It had been founded decades ago by Mr. Wendell, a philanthropist who had dedicated his life to creating a place where blind children could not only learn, but thrive. Melly had arrived at the academy when she was just 7 years old, and it had become her home in every sense of the word. The buildings were old but sturdy, constructed of brick and mortar that had withstood the test of time. Ivy climbed the walls, adding a touch of nature to the man-made structures. Inside, the classrooms were filled with adaptive technologies. Braille books lined the shelves, and tactile maps covered the walls. The teachers were dedicated, and the students formed a tight-knit community, each of them navigating the world in their own way, through their own set of skills. Melly had been born blind, and unlike some of the other students who had lost their sight later in life, she had no memory of ever seeing the world. But that didn't bother her. To her, the world was filled with sound, texture, and smell, and those were the senses she relied on to understand her place in it. She had developed her echolocation abilities over the years, using clicks, taps, and even the subtle rustle of her clothes to create a map of her surroundings. It wasn't perfect. She couldn't see details the way sighted people could, but it gave her independence and a sense of control that she cherished. As she and Mrs. Larson made their way toward the classroom, Melly clicked her tongue softly, the sound bouncing off the nearby walls and trees. She could see the shape of the school building ahead, its tall windows reflecting the morning light back in her direction. She could hear the distant murmur of other students making their way to class, their voices overlapping in a chorus of greetings and laughter. Mrs. Larson's hand rested lightly on Melly's shoulder, but Melly didn't need the guidance. She knew exactly where she was, and her steps were sure and confident. The door to the classroom creaked open as they approached, and Melly stepped inside, the familiar scent of chalk dust and polished wood filling her senses. She took a deep breath, savoring the smell. There was something comforting about classrooms, about the structure and order they offered. Here, she wasn't different. Here, she was just another student, eager to learn. "Morning, Melly," a voice called from the front of the room. It was Olivia, one of Melly's classmates. Olivia had lost her sight in an accident when she was 9, and though she had adjusted well, there were still moments when she spoke longingly of the things she missed seeing: sunsets, her mother's face, the ocean. But Olivia never let it bring her down for long. She was a fighter, and Melly admired her resilience. "Morning, Olivia," Melly replied, making her way to her usual seat near the front of the classroom. She placed her cane gently against the side of the desk and settled into her chair. The classroom was small, with only about 10 students, but it was filled with energy. The students chatted amongst themselves, their voices a mix of excitement and nervousness for the day ahead. Melly could hear the scrape of chairs being pulled out, the soft thud of bags being dropped onto the floor, and the shuffle of papers as everyone prepared for the lesson. Mrs. Larson took her place at the front of the room, her footsteps measured and steady. "All right, class," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Today we're going to continue our work on spatial awareness and mobility techniques. As you all know, being able to navigate the world with confidence is one of the most important skills you can develop." Melly felt a rush of excitement at the mention of mobility training. It was one of her favorite subjects. Learning how to move through the world without sight had always fascinated her. How she could rely on sound, touch, and even smell to guide her. It was like unlocking a secret code that only she and a select few others knew how to decipher. Mrs. Larson continued, "We'll start with some exercises in echolocation, then move on to obstacle navigation later in the session. I want each of you to focus on refining your technique, listening for the subtle cues that will help you build a more detailed picture of your surroundings." Melly nodded, already eager to begin. She could hear the excitement in the room rising as the other students prepared for the lesson. They all enjoyed these exercises. It was a chance to challenge themselves, to push the limits of what they could do without relying on their eyes. As the class got underway, Mrs. Larson guided them through a series of echolocation exercises. They each took turns using clicks and taps to identify objects placed around the room. For Melly, this was second nature. She clicked her tongue softly, sending out a series of sharp sounds that bounced back to her from the walls, the furniture, and the other students. Each sound gave her a little more information, a little more clarity about where she was and what was around her. The room filled with the sound of clicking tongues and tapping canes as the students worked through the exercises, their faces focused and intent. Though they couldn't see each other, there was a shared sense of purpose, a determination to master the skills that would help them navigate a world designed for sighted people. "Great job, Melly," Mrs. Larson said as she passed by Melly's desk. "Your echolocation is getting even more precise. I'm impressed." Melly beamed with pride. She had worked hard to develop her skills, and hearing Mrs. Larson's praise only fueled her determination to keep improving. She loved the feeling of independence that came with being able to move through the world on her own terms, without needing to rely on anyone else. As the class continued, Melly felt a sense of calm settle over her. She was in her element here, surrounded by people who understood her, who faced the same challenges she did. The world outside might be unpredictable, full of obstacles and unknowns, but within these walls, she was safe. She was seen. After the echolocation exercises, Mrs. Larson instructed the students to pair up for the obstacle navigation portion of the lesson. Melly was partnered with Olivia, and the two of them made their way to the small obstacle course set up at the back of the classroom. The course was simple but effective. Chairs and desks had been arranged in a maze-like pattern, and the students were tasked with using their canes and other mobility techniques to navigate through it without bumping into anything. "Ready?" Olivia asked, her voice filled with anticipation. "Always," Melly replied with a grin. She tapped her cane against the ground, listening for the subtle echoes that would guide her through the course. The two girls worked together, calling out to each other as they navigated the obstacles. Melly clicked her tongue occasionally, the sound bouncing off the chairs and desks in front of her, giving her a mental map of where to go. Olivia, relying more on her cane and sense of touch, followed closely behind. They moved through the course with ease, their steps sure and confident. Melly's heart raced with the thrill of it, not because it was difficult, but because it felt like freedom. Every tap of her cane, every echo that returned to her, was a reminder that she was in control of her world. She didn't need to see it to know it. When they reached the end of the course, Mrs. Larson clapped her hands together in approval. "Excellent work, both of you," she said. "You've come a long way." Melly and Olivia shared a smile, the sense of accomplishment filling the room like sunlight. It wasn't just about navigating the obstacle course. It was about the journey they were all on, learning to move through life with confidence, even when the path ahead wasn't clear. As the lesson came to an end, Mrs. Larson gathered the students together for a final discussion. "Remember," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the world isn't always designed for us, but that doesn't mean we can't navigate it on our own terms. You each have the tools you need to succeed, and I'm proud of how far you've come." Melly listened, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that Mrs. Larson wasn't just talking about mobility techniques. She was talking about life. The world outside the walls of the Wendell Academy might be challenging, but Melly wasn't afraid. She had learned how to find her way in the dark, how to listen for the sounds that would guide her, and how to trust herself even when the path wasn't visible. As the other students gathered their things and began to leave the classroom, Melly lingered for a moment, her cane resting against the side of her desk. She closed her eyes and clicked her tongue softly, listening to the echoes that filled the empty room. The sound bounced back to her from the walls, the ceiling, the desks. It was a world that only she could see, a world of sound and movement that was as real to her as any sighted person's world of colors and shapes. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of her cane in her hand, the familiar texture of the ground beneath her feet. The world was hers to navigate, and she would do it with grace, confidence, and the quiet determination that had carried her this far. And so, with one final click of her tongue, Melly gathered her things and stepped out into the world, ready for whatever came next. Part 2. Meeting Ross Givens. The soft murmur of voices echoed through the school's main hall as the students of Wendell Academy gathered for the day's assembly. Melly stood off to the side, her cane resting lightly against her leg, her head tilted slightly upward as she listened to the subtle vibrations around her. The hall was large, with high ceilings that caused sounds to reverberate for longer than usual. She clicked her tongue softly, the sound bouncing off the distant walls and telling her exactly how vast the space was. Today was different from the usual assemblies. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, an electric undercurrent that hummed through the room like a barely contained storm. A special guest was visiting, a businessman, someone important, though the details had been kept vague. Melly had heard snippets of conversation between the teachers earlier in the week, but no one had explained why this particular visitor was such a big deal. "He's one of the biggest names in the country," Mrs. Larson had said to another teacher just before class one day, her voice barely above a whisper. Melly's curiosity had been piqued, but she hadn't asked questions. It wasn't unusual for visitors to come to the academy. Philanthropists, government officials, even celebrities had been known to stop by to see the work that was being done at the school. But something about this visit felt different. The teachers were more anxious, the students more excited, and the atmosphere crackled with expectation. As the voices of her fellow students filled the hall, Melly tuned into the familiar sounds of her surroundings, mapping the space in her mind. She could hear the shuffling of feet as her classmates found their seats, the rustling of papers as the teachers prepared for the presentation, and the low hum of whispers that passed from one student to another. Everything felt sharper today, more alive. "Do you think he's famous?" Olivia asked from beside her, her voice filled with excitement. Melly smiled and shook her head slightly. "I don't know. I guess we'll find out." "Mrs. Larson said he's some kind of marketing genius," Olivia continued, her words tumbling out quickly. "She said he built his company from nothing, and now he's worth billions." Melly raised an eyebrow, though the gesture was more for herself than anyone else. "Marketing? Why would a marketing guy be visiting a school for the blind?" Olivia shrugged, her excitement undeterred. "Maybe he wants to help fund the school or something. Or maybe he just wants to see what we're doing here. Either way, it's pretty cool, right?" Melly nodded, though her mind was already drifting. She wasn't particularly interested in marketing or business. What mattered to her was the school, the place that had given her a sense of independence and confidence. If this man was here to support the school, then that was all that mattered. The sound of footsteps approaching the front of the room caught Melly's attention. She clicked her tongue softly, and the echo that returned told her that someone tall was standing at the front of the hall, near the podium. She could sense the shift in the room as the students quieted down, their whispers fading into expectant silence. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Larson's voice rang out, warm and steady as always. "Today we have a very special guest joining us. I know you've all been wondering who it is, and I'm excited to finally introduce him to you. Please welcome Mr. Ross Givens, founder of Givens Corp. And one of the leading voices in modern marketing." There was a ripple of murmurs through the crowd at the mention of his name. Melly felt a strange flutter of curiosity. Ross Givens. She had heard the name before, though only in passing. She knew he was a powerful figure in the business world, but beyond that, the details were fuzzy. Still, the energy in the room was unmistakable. Whoever this man was, he commanded attention without even having spoken a word yet. Ross stepped forward, his footsteps measured and deliberate as he approached the podium. Melly focused on the sound of his movements, trying to picture him in her mind. His gait was confident, but not rushed, and there was a distinct lack of hesitation in the way he carried himself. He didn't fumble or pause as he took his place in front of the room. This was someone who was used to being in control, someone who knew exactly where he stood in the world. "Good morning," Ross began, his voice rich and steady, with a depth that carried easily across the room. "Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you today." There was a brief pause, during which Melly could hear the faint sound of Ross adjusting the microphone. His movements were calm, unhurried. He didn't rush into his speech, didn't force his presence on the room. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to focus on him completely. "I've had the privilege of building my career in the world of marketing," Ross continued, "but I've always believed that true success is about more than just business. It's about the impact we have on the world around us. And when I look around this room, I see a group of individuals who are making an impact every day." Melly felt herself drawn in by his words, even though she wasn't sure why. There was a sincerity in his tone, a quiet confidence that made her want to listen more closely. He wasn't just delivering a rehearsed speech. He was speaking to them, directly, as if he understood something about their lives that went beyond the surface. "You may not know this," Ross said, "but I've been following the work being done here at Wendell Academy for a while now. This school is special. What you're doing here is important, not just for you, but for the world. You're proving that limitations don't define us. What matters is how we choose to navigate those limitations, how we adapt and thrive despite them." Melly's heart swelled at his words. She had heard similar sentiments from teachers and mentors before, but there was something about the way Ross spoke that felt different. He wasn't just offering platitudes. He seemed to understand, on a deeper level, what it meant to live in a world that wasn't built for you, and to find your own way through it. "I want to learn from you," Ross said, his voice softening slightly. "I want to understand how you've learned to navigate the world, how you've turned what others might see as obstacles into opportunities. Because, in many ways, that's what business is all about. Finding new ways to see the world, to solve problems, and to create something valuable." Melly's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing someone like Ross Givens, someone from the outside world, someone so successful, speak with such humility. He wasn't here to lecture them or to flaunt his achievements. He was here to learn from them. After Ross's speech ended, there was a round of applause that echoed through the hall, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and filling the room with warmth. Melly joined in, her hands clapping softly as she smiled to herself. She couldn't explain it, but something about Ross Givens had left an impression on her, a quiet, powerful impression that lingered long after the applause had faded. As the students began to file out of the hall, Melly stayed behind, tapping her cane lightly against the floor as she waited for the crowd to thin. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but there was a sense of unfinished business in the air, as if something important had yet to happen. "Melly, are you coming?" Olivia called from near the door, her voice light with curiosity. "I'll catch up with you in a minute," Melly replied, her voice calm but firm. There was something pulling her to stay, something she couldn't quite put into words. As the room emptied, Melly remained by the side of the hall, listening to the sound of the other students' footsteps fading into the distance. She clicked her tongue softly, sending out a series of echoes that told her the room was nearly empty now. Only a few people remained: Mrs. Larson, a couple of other teachers, and Ross Givens himself. "Excuse me," a voice said from nearby. It was Ross. He was approaching her, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle her. "Are you Melly?" Melly's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to know her name, let alone approach her directly. She nodded, though she knew he couldn't see the gesture from where he stood. "Yes, that's me." Ross smiled, though Melly couldn't see it. She could hear it in his voice, in the way the tone of his words softened. "Mrs. Larson told me about you. She said you're one of the most impressive students here." Melly felt a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks. "I don't know about that," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I just do what I can." "That's what makes you impressive," Ross replied, his voice thoughtful. "You don't let the world dictate what you can or can't do. You find your own way." Melly smiled, though she still wasn't entirely sure why Ross had sought her out. "I've learned a lot here," she said, tapping her cane lightly against the floor. "This school has given me the tools I need to be independent." Ross took a step closer, his shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor. Independence is something a lot of people take for granted, but it's also something we all strive for, in one way or another, whether it's in business, in life, or in the choices we make every day. Melly nodded slowly, considering his words. She could sense the depth of his understanding, the way he seemed to see beyond the surface of things. He wasn't just talking about marketing or success. He was talking about life, about the choices they all made in the face of challenges. "Can I ask you something?" Ross's voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "Of course," Melly replied, tilting her head slightly in his direction. "How did you develop your echolocation skills? Mrs. Larson told me that you use sound to navigate your environment. I find that fascinating. Melly smiled, feeling a surge of pride at his question. I started practicing when I was really young, she explained. At first, it was just small sounds, tapping my cane, clicking my tongue, things like that. But over time, I learned how to interpret the echoes, how to use them to create a picture in my mind of what's around me. Ross was silent for a moment, as if processing what she had said. That's incredible, he finally said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You found a way to see the world without using your eyes. Melly felt a deep sense of connection to Ross in that moment, though she didn't fully understand why. There was something about him that resonated with her, something that went beyond his words. He wasn't just impressed by her skills, he seemed to understand the deeper meaning behind them, the way they allowed her to live her life on her own terms. Thank you, Melly said softly. It's just how I've learned to navigate the world. Ross nodded, though Melly couldn't see the gesture. I think there's a lot we can learn from people like you, he said. People who find new ways to solve problems, to see the world differently. Melly smiled, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude wash over her. I guess we're all just trying to find our own way, aren't we? Ross chuckled softly. That's exactly right. As they stood there, the room quiet around them, Melly couldn't help but feel that this moment was important, though she didn't know why. There was something about Ross Givens that left a mark, something that would stay with her long after this conversation ended. Thank you for talking with me, Ross said, his voice warm and sincere. I've learned a lot from you today. Melly smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Thank you for listening. And with that, their conversation ended, but the connection lingered. As Ross walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance, Melly stood in the quiet hall, her cane tapping softly against the floor. She had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed.